In the episode right before this one, we talked about one metric that you can optimize for if you want to increase listener engagement on your podcast. In this episode, we're going to dive into 5 metrics that players like Apple and Spotify look for that signal strong listener engagement and ultimately influence your show's positioning on the charts, so that when you walk away from this episode, you will know exactly what action steps you can take, not only to get discovered by new listeners, but also to increase the social proof for your show and the overall visibility for your podcast. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Before we dive into what these 5 metrics are, I want to make sure we're on the same page. The podcast charts are not the ultimate measure of success when it comes to podcasting. Are they one of the top ways that listeners discover new podcasts outside of word of mouth and search? Yes. So can being on the chart certainly aid in the visibility of your show? Yes. Can it add to your social proof and credibility? Of course. But is it the ultimate measure of success for your podcast? No. The beautiful thing is there are many ways to get discovered by new listeners. The charts is one tool that can help drive that visibility. I want you to think of the podcast charts kind of like ranking on the first page of Google. If you're employing any kind of SEO strategy in your business, then you know that ranking on the first page of Google is the ultimate goal. But you also know that not every blog post you write is necessarily going to be ranked on the first page of Google. When you're ranking on the first page of Google, it can certainly help to increase visibility, to drive traffic wherever you're trying to drive that traffic. And similarly, the podcast charts can do the same. They can be an avenue of discoverability for your podcast. But being on the charts or not being on the charts should not be the metric by which you measure the success of your podcast. And I want you to understand this going in before we dive deep into the metrics, because sometimes clients will come to us and they will tell us, oh, I don't care about the numbers. I don't care about the numbers. But in reality, they do. They care about the numbers too much, to the detriment of their show and of their ability to show up. Because they look at their numbers and they go, oh my gosh, I'm only getting 16 downloads an episode. That's not worth showing up for. If only 16 people are listening, well, that's not worth my time and energy and effort that goes into creating this. The sad part about this is that they're not in podcasting for their listeners. They might say that they are, but in reality, the numbers mean too much to them. I'll never forget, I had Jordan Harbinger on the show. This is a podcast host who gets over 15 million downloads a month to his podcast. But when he started, he said, Courtney, downloads didn't exist. It was the most liberating thing ever because we weren't worried about how many people were listening. We were just creating for the joy of creating. And there is so much to be said for that. Yet, now that numbers do exist, they become the thing that can sometimes get in the way of us ultimately connecting with the listeners that we're here to serve. So I caveat all of this. Yes, we're going to dive into metrics today. Yes, we're going to talk about 5 ways that you can get your podcast on the top charts. But ultimately, I also want you to know that if your podcast is not on the top charts, that it's okay. Is it a goal to shoot for? Yes. But is it the ultimate measure of success for your show? No. Now, on the flip side of this, some people might look at the charts and they see it as this unreachable goal. A top 10 podcast, like, yeah, right, that's not even possible for me. So they don't even try. And that also is doing a disservice to your show and to the listeners that you're here to reach, because the charts are one way that people discover new podcasts. So when it comes to the charts, the way that I want you to look at them is number 1, as an avenue of discoverability, as a tool of discoverability and visibility for your show. And number 2, as valuable data that you need to build a long-term growth plan around your show. Because that is the simple name of the game in podcasting, bringing in new listeners and keeping them longer. That's it. If you're always bringing in new listeners, but they're not sticking around, you're not going to grow. But if you want to be on the charts in order to get discovered by more listeners who are looking for content like yours, who need to hear a message like yours, then it can be helpful to know, well, how many new podcast followers a week do I need to be getting in order to be on the charts, to be more visible, to be ranking on the first page of Google, so to speak, in podcast land. So whenever a client launches or relaunches a podcast with us, one of the things we teach them when it comes to ranking on the charts is to set it in your sights as a goal and then let it go. And instead focus on the activity that we need to be doing in order to get your podcast on the charts. And then when you do rank, take notice, because that chart position and those rankings and those numbers that your podcast is getting that week are going to give you really valuable data that we can then build a growth strategy around in order to keep you visible, to keep you on the charts. And so the beauty of this is that it turns the whole launch or relaunch process for a podcast into one big giant experiment. And when you're experimenting with something, it takes the pressure off, because then it's just a game. Then it's kind of fun. Then you're like, okay, well, if I do get on the charts, that'll be really great because it's going to give me valuable data. If I don't get on the charts, that'll also be great because it's still going to give me valuable data. Now, when we work with clients, 9 out of 10 times, they do land on the charts. They break the top 100, the top 50, the top 20, the top 10 in their categories. We have had some cases where clients have ranked number 1 out of all podcasts in their category in their country. In the cases where they don't rank, or maybe they rank, but it's not as high as they thought they were going to rank, it could mean a lot of things. It could mean maybe they were just in a more competitive category. Maybe they weren't able to drive the volume of traffic needed in order to compete with other podcasts who are also pulling in traffic in that category. But guess what? It's still a win, because no matter if you rank or not, you're still going to get the valuable data that you need to build that growth strategy. And in fact, for most clients, whenever they do rank, they're surprised because they're like, whoa, I thought it was going to take way more downloads to rank in this category. In fact, if you want to hear a real example of this, go listen to episode 269. We'll link it in the show notes below, because this was a case where this particular podcast host thought it was going to take a certain number of downloads to rank. Turns out it took half that, and it gave him the valuable data he needed to build a growth strategy around. It gave him the target he needed to shoot for every week in terms of, okay, what activity am I focusing on in order to get where I ultimately want to go? So the 5 things that signal high listener engagement to platforms like Apple and Spotify, which is indicative of the overall popularity of a podcast, especially during the first 8 weeks of that show, where this is critical, but also beyond that, into the long-term growth of that show, is number 1, follows. How many new daily subscribers or followers are you getting to your podcast? The reason why follows is so important is because it shows intent to listen. Intent to listen. If someone follows your podcast, it means they want more of your content. Maybe they've sampled an episode. Maybe they found you on a search. Maybe they found you through word of mouth. Maybe a friend told them about your podcast. They've likely listened to an episode, or maybe they read your description and they've skimmed some episode titles and they want to come back to it. So follows is really important. And that little follow button is often an underrated tool on the podcast platforms. People are always trying to push reviews and they're trying to push ratings and they're trying to get people to share the episode, when really you should be trying to get people to follow your show, because this is the number 1 metric that really matters when it comes to influencing your position on the charts. Second to that is listens and plays and re-listens. How long are people listening to your episodes? Are they coming back? Apple tracks unique devices to see, is someone listening just for a few seconds? Do they listen to one episode and never give your show another chance? Or are they coming back every week? And how long are they listening? Third is downloads. Are they actually downloading the episode? Now, for some apps, this is an automatic setting on the phone where when you have that app and you're following certain podcasts, it will automatically download the new episodes, unless you turn that feature off. So this is why also downloading the podcast, which is different from just listening, it actually means clicking where it says download. Sometimes it looks like a little cloud with like an arrow pointing down, or sometimes it's like you click the 3 little dots to the side of that episode and you look and it says download the episode. This is also an indicator of engagement, because that shows that someone really, really, really wants to be able to access that content regardless of when they're online or offline. Maybe they're traveling. Maybe they are flying on an airplane and guess what? They want to go back and they want to listen to that podcast episode. Ratings. This is number 4. Ratings are separate from reviews. It's the star rating system that someone can tap and say, okay, 1 star, 2 star, 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars. They don't necessarily have to leave a review if they leave a rating. Certainly it is better when they rate and review the show. But ratings is number 4. If someone is rating your podcast and they're leaving a 5-star rating, the fact that they took the time to leave that rating shows engagement. It shows that they're dialed in. It shows that they are tuned in to whatever it is that you're sharing. And then 5th is reviews, because it takes time to sit there and write a review on a podcast. But most importantly, ratings and reviews help to build social proof for the show. All of these things together, follows, listens, plays, and re-listens, downloads, ratings, and reviews, signal to Apple and to Spotify, hey, people like this show. And that's really important. But the number one metric that matters, that influences your position on the charts, is new daily followers. Again, because it's showing intent to listen. So when you know this, then you can begin to build a strategy around it. So what ideas can you come up with knowing your audience to get more people following your show? How can you adjust your episodes to keep the listeners you do have engaged? How can you encourage more people to leave a rating, to write a review, to help you build that social proof? And most importantly, what are you doing to get your podcast in front of new listeners every single day? And I don't mean just going out there and posting it to social media, because doing that is not going to ultimately help you grow your show. It gets it in front of your warm audience. Sure, it keeps it top of mind for people who already know, like, and trust you. But ultimately, it won't grow your podcast, because to grow a podcast, you've got to get your show in front of new listeners who are cold to you. And here's the thing. When it comes to podcast growth, all strategies work to some degree. But the degree to which they will work for your show is going to ultimately depend on how much time you have to devote to that strategy, whether or not you have a team supporting you, what kind of resources you have, what kind of bandwidth you have, and ultimately your audience as well, and the goals toward which you're striving for your show. So if you're listening right now and you're like, okay, but what strategies are best? What do I need to be doing to grow my show? How do I know what to do to get more followers or to get more reviews? This is where it's going to take rolling up your sleeves and being willing to experiment. The best growth strategies, in my opinion, are the ones that are the most simple to execute and are the most leveraged use of your time. So I can't give you the answer as far as what strategy is going to be best without knowing your audience, without knowing the goals of your podcast, and without knowing what strategies you've tried and which ones have worked to you to any degree that they've worked or not worked. But I will say that thinking outside the box here is going to work in your favor. It's kind of counterintuitive, but when you stop focusing on getting on the charts and start focusing on the activity you need to get there, it's going to dramatically increase your potential to rank. So to start, here are 5 things I recommend. Number 1, stop stressing about your numbers. Start using them to your advantage, but stop stressing over them. It's so easy to get caught up in the download count or to obsess over your chart position. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't rank this week. Like, I'm failing. No, you're not. Your numbers are just a data point that's telling you what's working and what isn't. So yes, we need to be able to use them to make smarter decisions for the podcast, but we don't need to spend our time stressing over them or worrying like, oh my gosh, I'm only getting this number of downloads. Instead, let's shift that focus and shift that energy and put that energy on the activity that's actually needed in order to increase the overall growth and engagement of your show. Another perspective shift that can be very helpful is to think of your podcast as more than just content that you're putting out into the world. Think of your podcast as your product, like a product. Products go through many, many, many iterations before they're perfected. But the best product companies out there have ridiculously loyal fan bases. WordPress, Subaru, Crocs. But the first iteration of that product was likely not the best iteration of that product. So when it comes to your podcast, think of it like a product. Don't just be putting out content out there. Think about your presentation. Think about your packaging. Think about your positioning of that product in the world. What's going to make someone want to hit follow on your show over someone else? What are you offering that no one else is offering or that's different than what other people are offering? How are you communicating that to your potential listener? Are you communicating that to your potential listener? Are you taking it seriously? A lot of people will nod and say, yes, I'm taking my podcast seriously. They'll be almost offended that I even asked that question. But if your show is not growing to the degree that you want it to grow, it's a valid question that you have to ask yourself as the host. Am I serious about this? Am I willing to do whatever it takes to grow my show? Am I willing to stay in the game as long as it takes, to trial and error and to experiment till I find what works for me? Some people aren't willing to do that, and that's okay. Podcasting might not be the best avenue for audience growth and conversions for them. But if you're willing to do that work, keep listening. Because the next thing that I will recommend to you is to stop counting the number of new listeners, but to start going deeper and building deeper relationships with the listeners that you have. I hear a lot of podcasters talk about this. Connect with your listeners. Talk to your listeners. But it's the one thing that tends to get dismissed because it's one of those things that's almost too simple. It's almost too simple, so now we're suspicious of it. Like, surely it can't be that easy. Yes, surely it can. But the way that you get there, and the reason why this one's so annoying whenever podcast experts talk about it, is because it is the work that most people are not willing to do. Instead of obsessing over how many new listeners you're getting or not getting, start thinking about, how am I treating the listeners that I've already got? Am I making them feel like they are part of something bigger here than just radio noise that they could just as easily listen to on their morning commute? Are you doing something every day to deepen the relationships with the listeners you have off of the podcast platform, outside of publishing an episode every week? I'll give you a hint. Social media may not be a great tool for directly growing a podcast, but it is one of the best tools for deepening the relationships and connecting with the listeners you have and having those conversations. Are you using it? Are you using it well? Step number 4 that I mentioned a moment ago is to experiment like your podcast success depends on it, because it does. And again, experiments and going into it with this experimentation mindset, it takes the pressure off. And experiments help you iterate so much faster so you can find what works and you can avoid what doesn't. Not every strategy is going to be a home run, and that's okay. But you're never going to get the home run if you don't hit, if you don't swing the bat. So think of your podcast growth strategy like a series of little experiments. And know that what works for someone else might not work for you, and vice versa. But experimentation is going to be the fastest way to find out what sticks for your audience so that you can double down on that. And then ultimately, and you know this already, but when you are a podcaster, you are signing up to play the long game. And if you got into podcasting and you listen to this show, chances are you have a message that you want to build a movement around. And I know you know that logically podcasting is a long game. We know that. Podcasting is a long game. It's a long play. But have you really committed to the process of podcasting? I didn't until I was almost 4 years in. Yes, I was showing up consistently. But there were a lot of things that I wasn't willing to do then that I'm doing now. So if you take nothing else away from this, yes, getting on the charts is one way to get more visible, but it's never the end goal. Look at it as a step in your long-term strategy for sustainable podcast growth. So as a host, we need to understand how the charts work, how they function, how we can leverage them to our advantage in order to get more listeners, to reach more listeners with our message, to build a movement around that message. But then we need to also act on that knowledge. So if you heard something today and you were like, you know what, I'm not doing that. Or you know what, I never thought to do that and I need to do that. Take that and run with it. Pick one thing, run with it. Don't just walk away from this episode and nod your head and say, yeah, okay, I got it, I get it, and continue doing what you're already doing, expecting different results. And sometimes all we need is a little accountability. And if you're listening and you're like, man, Courtney, I could really use someone like you looking over my shoulder on my podcast to help me grow my show. Or if you're thinking of launching a podcast and you want that podcast to be successful from day one so you don't have to waste your time on trial and error, then scroll down and book a call with my team. Let's see if you're a fit for Pod Launch. I will say we're very selective. Pod Launch is not for everyone. But if you're serious about going from unheard expert to binge-worthy thought leader in your niche, and you're committed to investing in the right support and doing whatever it takes to craft a podcast that actually grows your business and that converts your listeners to clients, then let's talk. Head to the show notes. You can click that link, grab a time on our calendar, and then stick around, because in the next episode, we have a very special guest and podcast automation coach who's going to show you the exact workflows you need to save up to 12 hours a week, not just on your podcast production, but on the content creation process that goes into podcasting, which often for us as hosts is the most time-consuming part of the process. You're going to be blown away by some of the very simple things that you can do to save hours every week when it comes to crafting your content so you can stay focused on what matters most. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.